Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we are live. How's it going, folks? Nice to see you today. My name is Dustin Cormier. Welcome to How to Rock Astrology. Today, we've been talking about the transit of Saturn in general. Saturn, actually, this whole series, we've been talking about Saturn natally. Then we talked about Saturn transiting in general, what Saturn's transits mean. And now, finally, we are talking about Saturn in its nature and its cycles, specifically Saturn transiting the houses. Today we're talking about Saturn transiting the third house. Welcome. As we go on later in the video, we're going to actually read an excerpt from Stephen Arroyo's Astrology Karma and Transformation about Saturn transiting the third house, which is very concise and very to the point, very well expressed and expanded upon. It's kind of the heart of this book in a lot of ways, and I highly recommend it. But for those watching, you don't need to get the context of the rest of the book. If you came here just for Saturn transiting the third house, you are in the right place. Now, I like to preface all these videos with just a thought from the Vedic sense that I'm a tropical Vedic astrologer. I use the same signs as the Western. I'm actually originally a Western astrologer, but I have taken on the Vedic philosophy and added it to my conception of Western philosophy. And there's a lot of good stuff there, and I always like to add my own little take on these aspects. So I consider that when Saturn transits the third house, there's a certain vibe which we're going to describe in this video. I would also suggest that Saturn transiting the third lord of a chart is going to give, you could read a similar reading from that happening. It almost means the same thing. So for example, I'm a Leo rising, okay? Leo is the first house, Virgo is the second house, second sign from my rising sign. Libra is the third sign from my rising sign. Venus rules Libra. So, Venus is carrying third house energy for every Leo rising. So, for me, as a Leo rising, Saturn transiting Venus will have a third house quality and tone to it. So that's something to consider. I also like to say that the health of the third lord is what's going to determine how hard or difficult or satisfying of a time you're going to have with Saturn transiting the third house. Because Saturn transiting the third is a continuation from the second house, where we had to learn about our values, about our financial foundation, and the people, the resources, the mental and material and emotional resources that we naturally express through the shape of what we are from the first house. We build a vessel, a self, a personality that attracts people to it, which is attracted to us, and which can exchange energy through what we intrinsically valuably are in our self. And this is the doorway, the path, the relationships we make, the way the relationships we make, the content of the second house acts as the foundation for the skills, the ways of communicating, the ways of understanding, the language we use to communicate what we are as Saturn comes to transit the third house. And natally speaking, wherever the strength of your third lord in the third house, if you have positive planets in the third house, and if your third lord, which is the sign ruling, the planet ruling the third sign from your ascendant, if that planet if it's in a positive house, if it's in the 5th or the 9th house or the 10th house, or if it's got benefic planets like Venus, Mercury, or friends, if it's got its friends close to it, if it's in a sign that is a good friend to that planet, then it's going to have a much easier time. You're going to have a much easier time when Saturn transits the third house. Because if your third lord, the planet which carries your third house, if Libra, again, for example, being the third house of Leo, or for anything. Virgo being the third house for a Cancer rising. Mercury would then be the third lord. So the health of the third lord determines whether you will have found useful skills and you will have an aggressive enough ability to make your speech heard, to say your voice, to have witty comments, and a mercurial sense and intelligence. If you have a strong third lord, you will grip all of these things, skills and all these things. And then when Saturn comes through the third house, it will open up the powers that you developed on when you were a child, through your siblings, through all things related to the third house, competitiveness and playing with others in the fun, light, Gemini-ish way that children do, because that's an early part of your childhood in your life. Developing as a teenager in competition with other people, sexually and puberty-wise and all things else. Competitive-wise. These are all things related to the third house. The third lord will show our capability to grip these things, as well as other things. It's hard to define whether you've got a good number 3 in your astrology chart, but I digress. These are all things to consider in context. But there are concise things that happen with Saturn transiting the third that can be spoken of universally. It's just that you've got to know your personal third house to know whether Saturn is going to find a comfortable grip on the themes related to this house, which it's transiting. So, just a little bit about the third house. This comes from The Art and Science of Vedic Astrology by Richard Fish and RYAN KURCZAK. Just remember, again, I'm a Vedic guy, but this is essentially going to be a Western reading when we read from Stephen Arroyo's much more Western psychological mind. I just like to reiterate themes related to the third house from different perspectives and cultural vantages, just to get a more well-rounded experience here. It's just part of what I like to do. The third house has an affinity with Gemini and Mercury because Gemini is the third sign. The key word for the third house is mental qualities. The third house governs mentality, curiosity, and research, and our willingness to explore pathways of the material resources we have accumulated in the second house. Specific indications for the third house include success through one's own efforts. Saturn transiting here will help us to gain success through our very own efforts and diligent habits and decisions at certain times, places, when relating with other people in our business or what have you. Third house relates to adventures, siblings, younger brothers and sisters, desires. It's a comma house, one of the air houses, which relates to desires and enjoyment, and the honest, earnest expression of ourselves in a light way, which doesn't have too much heaviness. That's why it relates to communication with others. It's also one of life energy, excitement, enthusiasm, initiative, and courage, bravery, and fear. Saturn coming into the third house makes us come to grips with making honest and earnest positive statements about what we think we are. Gemini, Mercury, it's worth it. It's a mercantile sign. It has to, you have to get the joke of relating with people and the fun joke of relating as from a mercantile perspective, which is that you can't take things too light or too hard or seriously. You have an item that's of value to people, and you can say, hey, it's worth this much. It may or may not be worth that much to different people, because everybody gets different things in a different way, but you have to make some statement of your thinking of what this value of this item is, and then people come and say, you know what, to me, that's actually only worth this much, and then you haggle, and then you say, yeah, all right, here, just take it. It's that kind of courage and bravery. It takes that kind of courage to say that you are sure about this thing, to be competitive in sports, to play a game of soccer, To play a game of pool. You know, you play pool with somebody and they say, like, how good are you? A good person with a good third house will say, well, I'm pretty good, I guess. And then they've got this wild look in their eye. It's like, oh, you really know what you're doing. And then you can do that. And then you can haggle and you can even say, or you might even just say, I don't know, I'm not that good. And then you can, what's the word for when you take advantage of someone? By showing that you're not that good, and then you make a bet. And then you kill them in that game, and then they're like, you were good. It's like the fun, the courage, the bravery it takes. And to do that kind of thing is what we build on in the third house, with siblings, with other brothers and other sisters. That's why it's related to siblings. Musicians, actors, expression, management, organization, letters, writing, journals, all communications. Saturn gives us kind of forces us to be able to deal with mercurial financial affairs and letters and constant communication with people. The third house is a Dastana house, which relates with suffering in a certain way, but only very slightly in the Vedic sense. It's not one of the worst. It's got a bit of ill maleficness to it because it's so sensational. Whenever anything is in the third house, it makes us salivate for it, and we're never satisfied with any planet that's in the third. But that's part of the wheel you got to spin with anything in the third house. Saturn transiting the third and any planet in the third will make us understand that we have to wield this thing in a clever, fun way and not take it too heavy, but not take it too light. Whatever it is mercurially in our lives that we deal with others through and ourselves through, we relate honestly in our experiences through. Saturn coming through here is going to build on all these. It's an Upachaya house, an increasing house in Vedic astrology, the third is, which means that it builds on itself over time. And if you're older, Saturn coming through your third house will be better because time has come through. This is, usually the second time that Saturn comes through an Upachaya house, a progressively better house. It's the second time it comes through that you find that you've actually enjoyed all the struggles of that house and that planet in that house. So if you have any planets in the third, you might have a hard time with it for a long time. You might meet competition and struggle through others with that. But eventually, if Saturn comes through the third house once or possibly on the second round, you will probably be forced to confront the fact that you've been developing what you need to act competently with that planet in your life and around other people, assuming that the third house is healthy and that you can do that. If not, Saturn will force you to try to, and it might just be a hard time either way. I digress. That's my own spiel in a Vedic sort of sense on this transit. Now we're going to talk about how Stephen Arroyo describes the transit of Saturn through the third house. And he builds upon what Saturn was in the second house. Because he constantly makes the point that the context of the transit, of the house transit, is important for what Saturn transiting a house means in relation to a whole cycle in the chart. This is your one chance to deal with what the third house is in relation to everything in your chart. Every Saturn transit of every house is important. Saturn in the third house. Saturn transiting the third house. As Saturn begins to transit the third house, the feeling that many of the practical matters that have long preoccupied attention are now settled enables the person to begin putting energy into new learning that will enhance the depth of one's professional background and value of one's ideas that you had experienced while Saturn was in the second house. So this period is not usually felt to be as heavy as Saturn's transit of the preceding Earth house, the second house, although the relative importance of the third house phase depends upon whether the person is intellectually oriented or engaged in work that involves communication or travel, essentially saying whether the person's third house or the third house lord is emphasized in the chart. There's often a tendency toward pointless worry during this period, and any insecurity about one's opinions or the depth of one's knowledge usually becomes apparent at this time. This is a time when one should concentrate on learning new facts, new ideas, and new skills, which will lend depth and practicality to the expression of one's intelligence. It is an excellent period for research or any kind of deep thought, and more effort is often put into structuring one's educational plans, teaching or writing methods, or the mode of expressing one's ideas. There's increased emphasis on serious analysis, practical thinking, and the capacity to express ideas more definitely in ways that others can relate to and understand the results of where that train of thought is going to go. Many people find that they stay up late reading more during this period, and a few people find that not only their method of communication, but even the tone of their voice changes. Such developments are brought about by the person's feeling that he or she needs to build a more solid structure upon which to base ideas and opinions. Hence, the individual often takes on more educational activities or pursues private research which can serve this purpose. For even though many of the ideas, facts, and skills learned during this time may not be used a great deal in the future, because it's the third house and this is just sort of an echo of the cardinal and fixed houses, the person's acquaintance with such a variety of techniques and points of view does provide a broad background of knowledge that can enable him or her to compare and judge theories, concepts, and methods on the basis of their own personal experience. To deal with them, to say, well, I had this experience one time with this, it's like a chemist saying, one time when I was young in college and Saturn was transiting my third house. They wouldn't say that unless they were an astrologer, but Saturn was transiting my third house, and I learned about phosphorus, that when you connect it with this other element, it makes a huge explosion. It blew up my whole laboratory, and it sucked. So let that be a lesson to you. That kind of experience in the field might have happened in the exploratory period of Saturn in the third, and that's why they can talk about it as a way to reframe in an experiential way what they're trying to say to people. Like, I kind of just did it with that example. Yeah, anyway. Broader learning or research is also necessary at this time in order to deepen one's sense of security about one's intelligence. For heretofore, the person may have been merely expressing opinions or ideas in the abstract, without having the immediate experience which lends them credence. Sometimes it's even a reputation thing. Sometimes it's like by you being able to explain in your personal experience this and that about this thing, it gives you, people look at you and say, oh wow, you've really had this experience, right? In many cases, this is also a period of increased travel activity, resulting from the demands of one's profession, familial duties, or other responsibilities. This is what gives the third house the adventurous tones that we've heard about. Saturn transiting the third is also a period of tying up loose ends in not only the intellectual areas of life, but also in one's relationships with other people. The third house being the end of the first cardinal thing, being the second house from the second house. It's a finalizing of the relationships and values intrinsic to oneself that were birthed in this when Saturn was transiting the second house. So one tends to define exactly what the limits are of various relationships with friends and acquaintances during this period. It's taking an exacting, discerning, disciplinary, transcendental view of how one's energy field is for better or worse by interacting with this person or this person or this person. You know, having a sexual conquest with some seedy person or group of people that's ultimately causing more attachment and damage to the energy field. You might see that and go, you know, I have a better place where I can put my relationship energy. Just as an example, you know. That can be with regard to anything. Working with a fellow coworker at your job, and you suddenly realize that they're very astute and true, but they just bash with you in a way that even they give you lots of value otherwise, the way you relate with each other, the amount of time you spend with each other at work, they're just not worth the way they are with you. Just bring out the worst in each other, and you cut it out. Tell the boss, I don't want to work with this person anymore. It's the kind of thing that can happen with Saturn transiting the third. Sometimes it can be overcritical about it, but generally it's for positive purpose, depending again on the strength of the third lord and the third house. So that was that, ladies and gentlemen, for this reading of Saturn transiting the third. I'm Dustin Cormier for How to Rock Astrology. If you enjoyed the way I talk about Saturn and all this fun stuff, feel free to check out the rest of this series, where we talk even more about Saturn transiting the houses. Saturn really in transit to everything you can learn about at the start of this series. And if you dig, for those watching live, keep an eye out. We're going to be coming on the next episode with Saturn transiting the fourth house, right after this. If this is your first time watching, like, comment, subscribe, ask me a question. Let me know what you think. I'd love to know how you guys take my interpretation of these transits. This is How to Rock Astrology. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay tuned, and I'll see you guys on the next episode of whatever we got going.